The eternal boy in the modern world. There is a particular kind of man who has become impossible to miss in the modern world. He is somewhere in his late 20s, his 30s, sometimes his 40s, or beyond. He is intelligent, often charming, frequently talented. He has talked about his future for a decade. He has begun things, degrees, businesses, novels, relationships, and abandoned most of them when the work became real. He moves between cities, between jobs, between partners, always sure that the next one will be the one that finally allows him to begin. His friends notice that nothing in his life has fundamentally changed in years. He notices it too in the dark hours, and the noticing is unbearable, so he reaches for a distraction, and the noticing passes. This figure is not new. He appears in Ovid as the boy who refuses the world. He appears in fairy tales as the youngest son who would rather dream than inherit. He appears in 19th century literature as the dandy, the wanderer, the brilliant young man whose promise never quite ripens. But there is something distinctive about his prevalence in our own age. The conditions of modern life seem almost designed to produce him in numbers and to keep him in his condition longer than any culture before us has tolerated. Sociologists describe an extension of adolescence into the late 30s and beyond. Economists describe a generation that has not bought houses, married, or had children at the rates of any preceding cohort. Therapists describe waiting rooms full of men who feel, in some way they cannot name, that their lives have not yet started. Carl Jung, working in the early 20th century, recognized this figure as something more than a personal failing or a generational quirk. He recognized him as an archetype, a recurring pattern in the human psyche that wears different clothes in different ages but carries the same underlying form. He gave him a Latin name borrowed from Ovid, Puer Aeternus, the eternal boy. And he set out to describe, with a precision few others have matched, what is happening inside such a man, what he is running from, and what it would cost him to finally become an adult. This essay is an attempt to follow that line of thought into our own time. It is about the man who never grows up, not as a moral failing, but as a psychological structure. It is about the conditions that create him, the wounds that drive him, the costs he pays for staying eternally young, and the difficult, unwelcome path by which a man who has lived too long in possibility might finally come to inhabit his own life. The myth beneath the diagnosis. To understand what Jung meant by Puer Aeternus, it helps to know where he found the phrase. Ovid uses it in the Metamorphoses to describe the god Iacchus, a child of mysterious parentage associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, a divinity who is forever young, forever unfinished, forever standing at the threshold of becoming. The phrase carries a quality that pure translation loses. The eternal boy is not simply someone who refuses to age. He is someone touched by the divine quality of unspent potential, beautiful, luminous, full of possibility, and cursed by the same quality, because what is unspent cannot become real. The seed that refuses to be planted remains forever only a seed. Variations of this figure appear across mythologies. The Greeks had Dionysus, the eternally youthful god of intoxication and dissolution, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The Egyptians had the boy god Horus before his trial. The Christian tradition has its own complex relationship with the divine child, and in the modern age we have invented our own version, perhaps the purest expression of the archetype in popular culture. Peter Pan, the boy who refused to grow up, who lived in a place called Neverland, and who was both enchanting and quietly terrifying, because nothing in Neverland was ever real, and nothing that happened there ever counted. J.M. Barrie, who created Peter Pan, knew exactly what he was writing about. His own elder brother had died in a skating accident at 13, and his mother, in her grief, came to relate to Barrie as if he were the dead child, a child who would, in her imagination, never grow up. Barrie wrote later about the strange psychological condition this produced in him. He understood, from the inside, what it cost a person to be loved as an eternal boy. He wrote Peter Pan partly as a love letter to that condition, and partly as a warning. Most readers since have caught only the love letter. Jung's insight was that figures like Peter Pan are not just stories, they are descriptions, in mythological language, of patterns that real people fall into. When Jung said the Puer Aeternus was an archetype, he meant that the pattern is older than any individual case of it, embedded in the structure of the psyche itself, waiting to be activated by the right conditions. A particular man becomes a Puer not because he is uniquely flawed, but because something in his life has woken this ancient pattern in him and given it permission to organize his existence. This framing matters because it shifts the diagnosis from the moral to the psychological. The man-child is not bad. He is not weak in some essential sense. He is, in Jung's view, a person inhabited by an archetype that he has not learned to negotiate with. A person who has confused identification with the archetype for actually being it. The work of growing up, in this framework, is not the work of becoming a different kind of person. It is the work of differentiating oneself from a pattern one has been living from the inside without knowing it. The provisional life. The most thorough psychological study of the Puer Aeternus was undertaken not by Jung himself but by his student and longtime collaborator Marie-Louise von Franz in a series of lectures delivered in Zurich and later collected as The Problem of the Puer Aeternus. She described the inner world of such a man with a directness that has made the book uncomfortable reading for several generations of men who have recognized themselves in it. Von Franz observed that the Puer almost always lives what she called the provisional life. His real life is somewhere ahead of him, in the next year, the next move, the next relationship, the next big project. The current moment is a waiting room. He is here, but he has not yet arrived. He has not committed to this job because the right job is still coming. He has not committed to this woman because the right woman is still out there. He has not finished this work because finishing it would mean putting it up for judgment, and judgment by the actual world might not match the verdict he has been giving himself privately for years. This provisionality is not laziness, although it can look like laziness from the outside. It is, internally, a refusal of incarnation. The Puer cannot bear to descend fully into the specific. The specific is small. The specific has limits. The specific costs you all the other lives you might have lived. To choose this woman is to lose every other woman. To commit to this work is to accept that you are not, in fact, going to be the great novelist or the brilliant entrepreneur or the famous artist or whatever the current daydream is. That you are going to be the person who did this particular work and only this. For the Puer, this loss feels like death. So he stays in possibility, where every life is still available to him, and he calls this freedom. Von Franz noticed that pueri tend to have a peculiar relationship with what she called the symptom of the next thing. There is always a next thing. The next move will be the one that frees him. The next girlfriend will be the one who understands him. The next book he reads will be the one that gives him the framework he has been missing. He is genuinely, tirelessly hopeful. And his hopefulness is, paradoxically, the engine of his stuckness, because each next thing is a way of postponing the present thing. Hope, in this configuration, is a defense against having to live the life one is actually in. She also observed that the Puer is usually very intelligent. Intelligence is part of the trap. A less articulate man might be forced earlier into the brute compromises of an actual life. The Puer can think his way around every demand reality makes of him. He can produce, on short notice, sophisticated explanations for why this is not the right time, why this is not the right person, why this is not the right job, why his refusal to settle is in fact a higher form of integrity. His friends, who love him, accept these explanations year after year. Eventually, they stop. But by then, he has often perfected the art of not noticing that they have stopped. The mother and the wound. Von Franz, following Jung, traced much of the Puer's structure to a particular relationship with the mother, not always literally with his actual mother, although often, but with the inner image of the mother, what Jung called the mother complex. To understand this requires putting aside the casual psychological vocabulary that has trivialized the term. A mother complex, in Jung's strict sense, is not a sentimental attachment to one's mom. It is a deep configuration of the psyche organized around an internalized image of the maternal, an image that, in the Puer's case, has become unconsciously identified with comfort, safety, total acceptance, and the absence of demands. In the healthy course of development, a child's relationship with the mother is gradually superseded by a relationship with the world, which is to say with reality, which is to say with the realm in which one's actions have consequences and one's choices close off other choices. The mother represents the original undifferentiated state in which one's needs were anticipated and met without one having to act. The world represents everything that comes after, the realm where one must act, must choose, must risk, must endure the failure of one's choices. The Puer has not made this transition fully. Some part of him still believes, beneath conscious awareness, that the world should function the way the mother once did, that needs should be anticipated, that effort should be unnecessary, that he should be loved for his potential rather than his achievement, that the universe should arrange itself around his unfolding. When the world fails to behave this way, he experiences this failure not as ordinary reality, but as a personal injury. The world is wrong. The job is beneath him. The woman doesn't really see him. The friends don't truly understand. This is the wound at the center of the Puer condition, and it is worth naming clearly. The Puer is a man who has not yet accepted that the unconditional acceptance he received, or thought he received, or longed to receive in childhood is not on offer from any adult relationship or institution. He is still, somewhere inside, waiting for the world to embrace him on terms it never embraces anyone, and until he gives up on receiving that embrace, he cannot enter into any of the conditional, costly, demanding embraces the world actually offers. The embrace of a real woman who needs him to be present, the embrace of a real vocation that needs him to do the work, the embrace of a real community that needs him to show up reliably over years. It is sometimes said, glibly, that the Puer needs to grow up and stop blaming his mother. This is both true and a profound misunderstanding of what is being described. The Puer's struggle is not with his actual mother, who may have been wonderful or terrible or anywhere in between. It is with the unconscious expectation, formed in earliest life, that some maternal force should still be smoothing his path. Naming his mother as the problem keeps him in the same configuration, only with hostility added. He is still oriented toward her, still organized by her, still living in the field she defines. The work is to step out of that field altogether, which is harder than blame and far less satisfying. The flight from the father. Where the Puer is unconsciously bound to the mother, he is often unconsciously fleeing from the father, or from what the father, in mythological terms, represents. The father in Jungian symbolism is not just the actual paternal figure. He is the principle of order, of limit, of structure, of the way things are. He is what the world demands of you whether or not you wish it to demand anything. He is the necessity of choosing, of committing, of becoming finite. Many pueri have had complicated relationships with their actual fathers. Some had absent fathers, some had punitive fathers, some had fathers who themselves were pueri, who failed to incarnate the principle they were meant to represent. But the underlying flight is not just from a particular man, it is from the larger principle of structure that fatherhood symbolizes. The Puer wants to live in a world without fathers, a world without necessary forms, without institutions that demand his loyalty, without traditions that expect his fidelity, without the slow, patient work of becoming someone who can be relied upon. This is one of the reasons our cultural moment has been so generative of pueri. Modern life, for many men, is structurally fatherless. The traditional institutions that once mediated the passage from boyhood to manhood, religious initiation, military service, the apprentice trades, marriage at a young age, the visible inheritance of a father's role, have largely dissolved. There is no longer a moment, or a series of moments, at which a boy is collectively recognized as having become a man. He is left to figure it out on his own, often without examples close enough to follow, and in the absence of any external structure of initiation, the internal work of becoming an adult becomes both more difficult and more easily avoided. The Puer's flight from the father is, paradoxically, also a flight from his own potential adulthood. The father he refuses is not only the external authority. He is the future self the Puer is meant to become, the man he would be if he stopped fleeing, settled into a life, did the work, accepted the limits, and discovered, on the other side of accepting them, what an actual adult human is. By refusing the father principle externally, the Puer also refuses to grow into it internally. He stays a boy not by accident, but by design, because remaining a boy is the only way he knows to avoid becoming the kind of man he has unconsciously decided he does not want to be. The senex. the shadow at the other pole. Jung's psychology insists on something that simple morality often misses. Every archetype has a shadow, an opposite pole that is bound to it and cannot be understood without it. The shadow of the puer is the senex, Latin for old man. The senex is the rigid, controlling, joyless figure who has so fully accepted the constraints of adult life that he has lost contact with all spontaneity and possibility. He is the bureaucrat, the dogmatist, the father who has become only a father, the worker who has become only a worker, the man whose face has settled into a permanent set of rules he has stopped questioning. Both the puer and the senex are pathologies. Both are partial. The puer has all the freshness of possibility but no roots. The senex has all the roots but no freshness. Each secretly longs for what the other has, and each tends to despise what the other represents, because what the other represents is the part of himself he has refused. This is important because the puer's worst fear is often that growing up means becoming a senex. He looks at the joyless adults around him, the men trapped in marriages they no longer love, in jobs they have outgrown, in routines that have become self-administered prisons, and he says, with some justification, that he does not want that. He is right not to want that. The error is in thinking that the only alternative to senex is puer, that the only way to keep one's vitality is to keep one's options open forever. This is a false dichotomy, and it is one of the central errors that keeps pueri stuck. The mature adult is neither puer nor senex. He is the person who has accepted the constraints of a particular life and discovered, within those constraints, a depth of engagement that the puer's surface freedom never makes possible. He has become finite, but his finitude is not a prison. It is a place. He stands somewhere. He can be found. The things he loves specifically, and the love is heavier and slower and more durable than the bright butterfly affections of his younger self. He has paid the price the puer refuses to pay, and on the other side of that payment, he has received something the puer does not even know exists. Jung described this synthesis as the work of individuation, the long, often difficult process by which a person integrates the opposing forces in their own psyche and becomes a whole self rather than an identification with one pole or the other. For the puer, individuation requires consciously incorporating what he has rejected: limit, commitment, reliability, the dignity of finitude. This does not mean becoming a senex. It means becoming the third thing, the adult who carries the puer's vitality into a senex's structure and is thereby neither. Why the modern world manufactures pueri. Every age has had its eternal boys, but our age has built a civilization that, almost incidentally, produces them in unprecedented numbers and rewards them, at least temporarily, for staying in the condition. It is worth asking why. Consider the conditions a young man encounters today. He is told from earliest childhood that he can be anything. He is given an education that emphasizes potential and self-realization over apprenticeship to a particular form. He is encouraged to keep his options open as long as possible. Through college, through graduate school, through a series of exploratory jobs, through a long pre-marriage phase of dating, through a perpetual deferral of having children until everything else is arranged. The cultural message at every stage is that commitment is a closure, that locking oneself into a specific life is a failure of imagination, that the goal is to remain free, mobile, potential. These messages are not entirely wrong. There is something genuinely valuable about expanding possibility, about not forcing 18-year-olds into life decisions they cannot reverse, about giving people room to discover who they are. But the messages, taken to their extreme, become an ideology of perpetual provisionality, and that ideology is exactly the inner condition of the puer made into a social program. Then there is the digital environment, which deserves a particular mention. The internet, and especially the algorithmically curated parts of it, is structurally a puer's paradise. It offers infinite stimulation without commitment. Every form of life is available to be sampled without being entered. One can spend years researching a vocation without practicing it, observing relationships without forming them, watching philosophical content about the meaning of life without ever risking one's own. The puer's defining move, to stay in the realm of possibility rather than enter the realm of action, has been industrialized at planetary scale and offered to him for free. There is also the matter of economic conditions. For young men in much of the developed world, the traditional markers of adulthood, owning a home, supporting a family on a single income, building wealth through patient labor in a stable career, have become significantly harder to attain. This is not their fault, and it is not made up. It is also not the whole story. Plenty of men in genuinely difficult economic conditions have nonetheless managed to inhabit their lives and accept their commitments. But the difficulty of the external conditions provides a permanent rationalization for postponement, and the Puer's psychology gratefully accepts the gift. Finally, there is the cultural disappearance of any positive vision of mature masculinity. Our age has rightly criticized many of the older models: the patriarch, the authoritarian father, the man as provider and emotional cipher. But it has not, on the whole, replaced them with anything coherent. A young man asking what kind of man he should become finds, in much of his cultural environment, either a parade of broken caricatures or a polite silence. In the absence of any compelling image of mature manhood, he stays a boy by default. There is no figure on the other side of his potential transition that calls to him. The costs. It can sometimes seem, from the outside, that the Puer has gotten away with something. His life is freer than other people's. He answers to no one. He does not endure the boredom of a long marriage or the indignity of a settled job. He is having fun, or at least appearing to have fun, while his more committed peers grow gray and tired. The case for staying a Puer can look strong if you only count the things he has avoided, but the costs accumulate, and they accumulate at a rate that becomes visible only late. A man in his 20s who is provisional looks like a young man with promise. A man in his 40s who is still provisional looks like something else. Friends who once believed in him have stopped expecting much. Women who once might have built a life with him have built lives with men who could be present. Work that once seemed merely deferred has now genuinely passed him by. The contemporaries who started where he started have, by simple persistence, accumulated decades of experience and depth that he no longer has time to match. The freedom he has been protecting turns out to have been freedom from depth, and depth, it emerges, is what makes a life feel like anything at all. There is also a particular kind of suffering the Puer endures privately, which he often hides even from himself. It is the suffering of someone who watches his own life from a slight distance, who never quite shows up to it. The girlfriend he is half committed to never quite has him. The work he is half doing never quite expresses him. The friendships he keeps light never quite hold him. He moves through his years like a tourist through a country he has not bothered to learn the language of, charming and pleasant and completely uncontainable, and the country, for its part, never knows him. Von Franz noticed that pueri often suffer from a peculiar kind of depression that does not always look like depression. It can present as listlessness, as a chronic, low-grade boredom, as a sense that nothing is quite real. The Puer who is honest about his inner life will often say, if you press him, that he does not feel like a real person. He feels like a possibility of a person, hovering above a life he is not yet committed to entering. This sensation is sometimes mistaken for deep philosophical insight. It is, in fact, an accurate report of his condition. He has not, in fact, fully entered his life, and so he does not, in fact, feel like a real person. The diagnosis is right. The cure is the hard part. Becoming real. If the Puer's condition is the refusal to fully enter his own life, then the path out is, in essence, the work of entering. This sounds simple. It is not. It is, in fact, the most difficult thing such a man will ever do, because everything in his psychological structure has been organized around avoiding it. The path requires undoing, slowly and painfully, the habits of avoidance that have become his way of being in the world. The first step is usually the most resisted, to commit to something specific and to stay with it past the point at which staying becomes uncomfortable. Not the right thing, not the perfect thing, something specific that he can actually do, that has actual demands, a particular job, a particular relationship, a particular practice. The Puer's instinct, when the discomfort comes, will be to leave, to find some reason why this was not, after all, the right one. The work is to recognize that the discomfort is not a sign of wrong choice. It is a sign of contact with reality. It is the friction of a life that is finally beginning to be real. Von Franz famously prescribed work, actual, sustained, often boring work, as one of the central remedies for the pure condition. Not work as ambition, which the pure is excellent at. Work as discipline, as the daily showing up, as the willingness to be the kind of person who does what they said they would do, whether or not they feel inspired. This sounds banal. It is not banal. For the poor, who has lived his life on the principle that he should only do what feels right in the moment, the commitment to do something regardless of how it feels is a kind of revolution. It is the practical method by which he becomes a person who can be relied upon, first by others, and eventually, more importantly, by himself. The second step is to grieve. The poor cannot become an adult without mourning the specific lives he is now choosing not to live. To commit to this woman is to grieve all the other women. To commit to this work is to grieve all the brilliant alternative careers he was going to have. To commit to this place is to grieve every other place he might have lived. This grief is real and it is heavy, and the poor's instinct will be to flinch from it, to keep telling himself, even after committing, that this is just for now, that the other lives are still possible. The grief work is to allow oneself to actually lose them, to say goodbye to the man one might have been in order to become the man one actually is. The third step, which sounds strange but is essential, is to find or create the structures that the modern world has stopped providing. In the absence of cultural rites of passage, the pure must construct his own, through deliberate commitments that mark thresholds, through mentors and elders he chooses and submits to, through communities whose membership requires him to show up and be counted. This work is harder than it would have been in a culture that did it for him. It is not optional. The psyche needs initiation. If the culture does not provide it, the individual must improvise it, or remain a boy. The fourth step is to become acquainted with one's own depth. Jung believed that the pure's flight from the world is also a flight from his own inner life, that the surface fantasies about brilliant futures and perfect partners are defenses against actually meeting the more difficult, more interesting figures who live underneath them. The work of growing up includes the work of going inward, reflectively, slowly, often with help, and learning who one actually is beneath the dazzling surface. This inner work and the outer work of commitment are not opposed. They are the same work seen from two sides. A man who is finally inhabiting his own life from the outside is also, inevitably, beginning to inhabit it from the inside. The eternal and the real. There is something the pure is right about. The mature adults he sees around him are, often, joyless. They have given up too much. They have settled in the bad sense, accepted lives that are smaller than they should be, allowed their inner fire to become only embers, traded the poor's reckless aliveness for a security that is real but does not feel like much. The poor, looking at them, says, "Not that. He is right not to want that." The mistake is only in his conclusion that the alternative is to remain a boy. The actual path, the one Jung pointed toward, is to become an adult who has not lost the boy, not the man who is still the boy, that is the poor's stuck condition, but the man who has incorporated the boy, who carries his vitality and curiosity and capacity for wonder into the structure of an actual life. This is rare. It is rare because the work is hard, and because the cultural conditions for it are weaker than they used to be, and because the path is one each man has to walk largely alone. But it is possible. There are men, here and there, who have done it. They are usually quieter than you would expect. They are not particularly impressive at parties, but there is a quality about them that the Puer, in his honest moments, recognizes and longs for. It is the quality of someone who has shown up, who is here, who can be found, who has paid the price of becoming finite, and in paying it has become real. The man-child, Jung saw, is not a moral failure. He is a person paused at the threshold of his own existence. The pause can last a season, or a decade, or a lifetime. It ends, when it ends, with a single difficult act repeated over years, the act of stepping forward, into the specific, into the small, into the actual. The eternal boy will always live somewhere inside the man who has finally grown. He will not be killed, only relocated. He will become a source of vitality rather than a controlling principle. The man will keep some of his lightness, some of his openness to wonder, some of his refusal to harden completely. But he will keep these things from inside a life he has chosen, which is the only place, in the end, that any of them are worth having. The psychology of the man-child is, finally, the psychology of every person who has not yet fully said yes to their own life. And the cure, if there is one, is not a cure, but a long and difficult yes, said again every morning, until one morning the saying is no longer in question. Until one morning a man wakes up and finds, somewhat to his surprise, that he has become real.